I've been playing Curse the Dead Gods a lot this past month, and now that the game has left early access with its full release, it's time to do a deep dive and review. The game has cracked my top 5 roguelites, so I'll talk about what I like about it, what I don't like about it, and I'll briefly compare Curse the Dead Gods to Hades because I've seen so many other people talk about those two games together. Let's get into it. Curse the Dead Gods is an action roguelite with a souls-like feel to it. It has a focus on tight and responsive combat that can be punishing at times and incredibly rewarding at others when you start to get good at it. The game has a lot of moving parts to master and understand, some of which add gameplay depth and others of which feel less influential. At its core, you fight through a series of levels that you select on a minimap, you clear enemies in each room in this level before progressing, and you fight through a series of bosses until you've beaten the run. In each fight, you can dodge, parry, or attack using your main weapon, offhand, or heavy weapon. A lot of the skill in the combat comes from timing your dodges and parries, as well as managing your limited stamina resource that determines how often you can dodge, as well as how often you do certain types of attacks, such as using your heavy weapon or completing certain combo finishers. There are also a lot of great risk-reward choices and mechanics in this game as well. For example, if you complete a successful parry, you restore some stamina, and the enemy is weakened, causing them to take more damage for a limited time. But the parry window is much smaller than the dodge window, so it requires more precise timing to avoid getting hit. There's also a lot of risk-reward when choosing when to attack and when to dodge, and it's definitely one of those games where if you're impatient, you'll be punished for it. If you try to spam an enemy with attacks, you might end up taking a couple attacks yourself. And along with that, you really need to master the enemy movesets and learn them if you want to go far. And a lot of the fun in the game comes from understanding and learning these different enemies and the best ways to counter them. Additionally, you can combo your weapons with each other during each fight. You can attack with your main weapon, including its finishing attack combo that deals extra damage. You can also choose to attack with your offhand weapon instead, or you can start a combo with your main weapon and finish it off with your offhand weapon for a different effect that might better fit whatever situation you have or deal more damage. For example, you might choose to finish off a combo with your offhand whip instead of your main hand claw because the offhand whip combo attack deals more damage in a wide area as opposed to the smaller radius of the claw finisher. And I'll dive more into the weapons later on in this review. You can also get relics on each run, either in shops or shrines or from enemy drops. These give you buffs across your run, and this is really where you create your build in addition to what weapon you have and what their modifiers are. Usually you go for certain synergies, so for example, you might want the increased poison damage relic if your attacks deal poison damage, but other relics are just more general buffs, such as ones that give you pure stat buffs that increase damage or health. Rounding out your build, you can select up to 3 blessings or buffs to start your run with that gives you even more build variety, and I'll talk about those more in the progression section. Additionally, across rooms and levels, you have to manage your corruption, which you can think of as analogous to stress in Darkest Dungeon. In general, your corruption goes up as you enter each new level, get hit with certain enemy attacks, or when you choose to increase your corruption in favor of getting an item or upgrade at a shrine. Whenever you come across a shrine or shop, whatever you want to call it, you can always buy upgrades, items, or weapons with gold or corruption. And when you reach a certain threshold of corruption, you get curses that give you some negative effect, often with a small positive bonus as well. So for example, there's a curse that makes you lose gold when you're hit, but it also makes you take a little bit less damage. On the other hand, there are other curses that are more purely negative, such as ones that make all traps go off instead of only some of them. I do like these curses and corruption mechanic. I think it adds another nice risk-reward mechanic to the game. We can decide whether it's worth getting that extra curse, getting that extra corruption, in order to buy some weapon upgrade, get some new relic, things like that. And while the curses are mostly net negatives, that's the point, they can have some fun effects that can change your runs in important and meaningful ways and add some nice variety. There's also a cap to the number of curses, so if you get the 5th final curse, it's very powerful. You basically just lose your health until either you die or you win. So if you get that final curse, you're probably going to lose your run unless you're right at the boss. So you really do have to manage the corruption as you play. It's not just like extra little modifiers. The last big mechanic I'll talk about now is light and light management. Basically, you have a torch that provides light around you, lets you see traps and things on the ground. You can also light braziers in rooms around you to provide lighting. In the light, you take less damage from enemies than you do in the dark. So managing that light is a good thing for survivability, for doing well. And I think this mechanic could have a lot more depth than it does, but to be honest, it usually manifests as using your torch when you walk between fights to see traps and things like that, lighting a brazier to start each fight, get some light there, and then forgetting about it for most of the engagement. There are some other unique relics and weapon modifiers that interact with either light or darkness in various ways, but it wasn't really as engaging a mechanic as I thought it would be at first. So as you can see, Curse has a number of different combat and game mechanics to really learn and master. And these lead to a number of different playstyles and a real depth to the combat, a real depth to the game. The The game also actually does a pretty good job of easing you into the game, which I'll explain in the progression section, so it's more noob friendly than a lot of other punishing, soul-style games, at least in my experience. And while it seems like a lot of moving parts, and I guess it is, it's also very easy to feel for everything pretty quickly. It's not overwhelming. You'll probably pick up all these mechanics pretty quickly, even though there is additional room for mastery, there's a lot there. Speaking of that punishing nature, Curse of the Dead Gods is usually punishing in a more attrition sense than a burst sense. And what I mean by that is, you usually lose by taking a lot of sloppy hits here and there that make you too weak to fight the boss, or you might get overwhelmed by your corruption if you don't manage it well. But it's not the type of game where you'll get one-shot by a mistimed parry. There are a couple exceptions, so while you won't get one shot, there definitely are times you can get stun locked and lose a large portion of your health bar, especially in a couple boss fights before you really learn them, their movesets, things like that. Or also when you run across certain specific enemy groups, certain enemies just can stun lock you a lot better than others. What I mean by stun locking is after you take a hit, you can't move for a fraction of a second. So if you get hit with an unfortunate chain of attacks, you're basically just stuck in place until they feel done attacking you and you've lost a sizable chunk of your health bar in the process. Also, something that annoyed me at first and took a while for me to learn is that your hitbox is a lot larger than you think, and the enemy attacks have a wider range than you think. Basically, unless you're really sure they can't hit you, assume enemy attacks are in range. There are so many experiences I had while learning the game where I assumed I was safe from an attack, I assumed I was far enough away, but I actually got walloped because I didn't bother to dodge what I should have. You do get used to it after a while, but it's still annoying at times. And as another aside, I definitely enjoyed this game less if I was sleepy or tired because of that importance of reaction time along with the punishing nature. I like to talk about RNG and randomness in roguelites because it's a core part of the roguelite genre. It should provide fresh runs again and again in theory, but can sometimes be annoying or frustrating in practice. As a whole, I don't think randomness plays an oversized role in this game, but there are a couple of areas where randomness can really make or break a run in Curse of the Dead Gods. First, as I mentioned previously, Curse is a really punishing game, but there are very few healing spots on each run. Because of that, having some form of healing versus having no healing in your build can make a really big impact. I found that I basically couldn't win a full run without some form of healing because you'll probably take small damage here and there, and being able to counteract that at all with some form of sustain, some form of health regeneration is a huge advantage. You can control this a little bit, so the healing comes from relics or weapons effects that you can choose to prioritize, pick up when you find them, but you can't always guarantee healing. I usually found some form of healing, but it was very noticeable when I didn't. Second, the game has some soft DPS checks. Basically, when you pass a certain DPS threshold, the game gets much easier. Being able to kill a basic enemy in one combo is almost a must, and if you can't, the game is much harder and much slower. This is because when you enter a room, there are usually 3 to 6 enemies, and if you can't clear a couple of them really quickly, you're more likely to run into a scenario where you don't see incoming attacks from enemies, can't time all your dodges, or just end up in a frustrating stun lock scenario where all 6 enemies attack you at once. There are a lot of things that affect this DPS, such as which weapons you find, how well your relics synergize with each other and your weapons, etc. So there are a lot of chances to get good enough DPS, but if you happen to not cross these various soft DPS thresholds because of bad drops, bad RNG, the game is much harder and also just much less fun because it feels tedious and slow. Along similar lines, weapon modifiers are randomized, and some are just much better than others, or scale much better into the late game, into the final boss. But I will say, there are also a lot of counter RNG measures. For example, as I'll talk about in the progression section, once you unlock this ability, you can choose from a set of starting weapons, you can reroll weapon shrines to get new choices, to get better weapons, and you can choose to focus on weapon upgrade rooms in the map if you don't cross that DPS threshold. Basically, while RNG can matter a lot for DPS, and for healing as well, you unlock some good counter RNG measures the more you play. Also, no loot is worthless in Curse, because you can always turn unwanted loot into something else, whether it be gold, reduced corruption, healing, whatever it is. And that's something I really liked about the game. I like games that make all loot useful, as opposed to having a lot of useless and just bad drops. Randomness does also play a role in what rooms you get, what enemies spawn, those kind of things. That's mostly just good variance as opposed to frustration, with the exception of a couple combos of enemies that have really high stun lock potential were frustrating to fight. So randomness is important. I think not getting certain things like healing can turn a good run into an impossible run or just a much, much harder run. But again, I don't think it's a game where you often feel frustrated by that RNG because there are so many RNG roles, so to speak. There's so many shops, shrines, loot you find in the ground, so many chances to get what you need. And there's some good built-in counter RNG measures as well. That said, Curse the Dead God does lack in variety. It doesn't have that much enemy variety, it doesn't have that much weapon variety either. I'll talk about how the different runs work in a second, but before you get to the actual full mixed runs, there are very small enemy pools, which is helped a little bit by the elite enemy mechanic. Basically, when you get later on in each run, you can run across more powerful versions of enemies, elite versions, that have slightly different and stronger movesets. But it's still not a game that shines in the enemy variety. There's also a similar problem with weapon variety as well. While there are a good number of weapons in the game, there are not a lot of weapon types. There are 4 types of main weapons, 4 offhand weapon types, and 3 heavy or 2-handed weapons. And with a couple exceptions, every weapon of a certain weapon type has the same moveset. So all of the swords had the same moveset, and all of the shields had the same moveset, for example. What separates different weapons are different effects. So some might have poison damage or a certain critical hit condition. Basically, the different weapons add a lot more build variety or sometimes different combo focuses for your game. So for example, if you have a sword that deals critical damage on charged attacks, you might do more charged attacks than you would do otherwise, and aim for critical hit relics to flush out your build. But at the same time, each sword plays very similarly because they're the same moveset. And beyond that, I often found myself using the same combo or 2 in each fight. So even though you have a main hand, offhand, and 2-handed weapons at all times, you can combo with each other, I would usually just fall into a specific combo of whatever was the most DPS at that time, while occasionally using a different combo if I needed to situationally. It's just not the type of game where you're going to have a bunch of different weapons that feel really different, that feel really distinct. If you want a game like that, like Dead Cells or Gungeon, you're just not going to find that in Curse the Dead Gods. However, I actually don't think this is a deal breaker, either this lack of enemy variety or weapon variety, because the game is so focused on learning enemies, so focused on mastering the mechanics and playing that tight souls-like combat, it's really not about the variety. And so having fewer enemies to learn isn't as big of a problem. Also, I will say, I do like the boss design in this game. There are technically 10 bosses, and I think they all do a good job being different from each other enough, as well as utilizing the mechanics in the game nicely. But if that moveset and combo repetitiveness is something that's going to bother you, something that just bores you, it might not be the best game for you. I like to talk about progression in roguelites because, along with RNG, it's a core part of the roguelite genre that should add replayability. There are 2 main forms of progression in Curse the Dead Gods, which are different levels you unlock and play, as well as different items and blessings you can use on your future runs. Speaking about the levels first, basically, when you first start playing, you play the temples of the 3 gods in 3 distinct levels. Each level unlocks a new mini-boss, so you start the game with 1 mini-boss each. The next level of each temple is longer and has 2 bosses, and the final level of each temple is the longest and has 3 mini-bosses. After you've unlocked all of these, you unlock what I think of as the real actual run, which has mixed enemies across different temples, mixed maps, and bosses from all 3 temples, as well as the true final boss, which in my opinion was a pretty fun fight. This system, I think, does a really good job of teaching you all the enemies, the bosses, the game mechanics in a more controlled way that isn't overwhelming, and that's really good because the game can be so punishing that it's nice to be able to ease into it as a player who's newer to the game and not feel overwhelmed. Even beyond completing what I call the actual run, there are more challenges that lead up to a final difficulty level that gives a greater challenge and the real story ending. So the game really has a lot of difficulty levels to climb, though perhaps not as much as a game like Dead Cells, though I'm not entirely sure because I haven't gotten that far past the first full run that I completed. You can also try the special events, which you can think of as equivalent to daily runs and other roguelites. They have specific challenges or modifiers, such as a run that only lets you use a certain weapon, things like that. The other main form of progression is the weapons and blessings unlocks. As you clear the first few levels, you unlock the ability to have up to 3 blessings, which are run-long buffs you can choose from the start. You must also unlock each blessing individually, in addition to the ability to equip them, and you'll get the currency to do so while completing your runs from beating random enemies and bosses. These blessings can have more minor effects, or they can really be build defining. So for example, one run I started with the claws that scaled with perception. They dealt more damage as I had more perception points. So I started out my build with blessings that all helped me get more perception as I went through the run. You can also unlock different weapons you want, though there are a couple different weapons that require more specific challenges. You can't just use the currency you get from beating bosses. Along with that, you can unlock weapon pedestals, which let you choose a starting loadout from different randomized options. Finally, you can unlock Divine Favor, which basically just lets you reroll shrines or altars on your run. As a whole, I found these unlocks to have pretty good pacing. There is certainly a kind of floor where you feel much weaker until you reach a certain number of unlocks, such as having all 3 blessing slots. That's a big power spike, as well as a couple of weapon pedestals, so you're not just starting with the basic and not very good weapons. But I think you reach that floor pretty fast, and I enjoyed the process of unlocking things even after that. let's talk briefly about the story in Curse of the Dead Gods. The game has a Mayan or Aztec theme, and you're basically fighting through these ruins of a temple of the dead gods, per the name of the game. Beyond that setup, there's only very little in the way of direct story, but there is a codex with lore entries for all the enemies and bosses that you face that really flesh out the world, flesh out the game. The game also has a couple nice cinematics, and I like the overall art style of the game. It has more story and lore than a lot of other roguelites, but it's still not as story-driven as a game like Hades. And on that note, I want to talk briefly about how Curse compares to Hades, because I've seen so many compare those two games. Obviously, they're both action roguelites, so they have some similarities there, but they feel very different in a lot of other ways. Curse of the Dead Gods is focused on tight, souls-like combat, while Hades focuses on a much more freestyle combat, for lack of a better word. I wouldn't really consider Hades to be a bullet hell, but it's more bullet hell than Curse is. On that note, I think one of the biggest differences for me in terms of the feel of the gameplay between these two games was that relative importance of timing versus positioning. In Curse of the Dead Gods, it's really important to time your dodges, attacks, and parries, so that you don't take damage and so that you can deal your damage efficiently. Along with that, there's the importance of stamina management, both in your dodges and attacks. However, it often doesn't matter as much where you are positioned relative to enemies, because the enemies will continue to change their attack direction to hit you as they attack. So even as they're attacking, they're aiming, they're moving in order to hit you. In contrast, I feel like Hades is a game where positioning matters more, relatively speaking, than it does in Curse. Now, don't get me wrong, both positioning and timing matter in both games, but Hades is much more forgiving on timing of dodges, and it's much easier to actually get away from enemy attacks than it is in Curse, where the enemies have really large ranges and stronger homing effects. You also don't have that shared stamina pool for dodging and attacks as you do it in Curse, so Hades can be a game where you spam dodges and spam attacks much more than you would in Curse. In regards to upgrades or builds, your builds in Curse don't change your gameplay as much as they do in Hades. In Curse, your builds might have a large impact in terms of DPS, what types of combos you do, what mechanics you focus on, but there's no Curse of the Dead Gods equivalent of a Poseidon boon that makes your dodges knock back enemies. There's no equivalent of a Hermes boon that increases your attack and movement speed. Because of that, I think Hades has more gameplay variety, while Curse is more focused on synergies and effects that don't change the core gameplay as much. Because Curse is really focused on that mastering of timing, learning enemy attacks, over a variety of things like movesets, abilities, those kind of things. In terms of progression, I won't really do a deep dive here, but I think as a whole, the progression system between these two games has a similar overall feel. In playing through both these games, there's a certain floor of progression that's needed to really feel like you've reached the power level you're supposed to be at. Hades might have a little more vertical progression, a little more just direct buffs to your character across runs, but as a whole, they both have that mix of vertical and horizontal progression and unlocks. Hades also has more customization in terms of its difficulty levels, but Curse has a good number of difficulty types as well, and they both do well in that area. Finally, one of the big reasons that Hades was so popular among people that don't usually like roguelites is because of its story, its presentation, its amazing voice acting, the more artistic qualities of the game. As I mentioned, Curse does have a decent amount of lore and some story, but it's just not as story-driven as Hades, doesn't have that high-quality voice acting, doesn't have those things that help give Hades the charm that it has. So which one you prefer obviously depends on what you're looking for. Curse has a tighter combat with larger relative focus on timing, mastering the mechanics, those kind of things, whereas Hades has a larger relative focus on positioning, allowing for a more spammy type of gameplay, and it has more mechanical variety in its weapons and boons as well. Additionally, Hades has a story, voice acting, and soundtrack qualities in League of its own in a way that Curse does not. But if you want a more Souls-like game, Curse is going to do that in a way that Hades won't. So what's my verdict on Curse of the Dead Gods? This game is one of my new favorite roguelites, and there's a lot that it does really well. It has tight, rewarding combat, but eases you into the game in a nice way. It has a nice learning experience. There are a lot of mechanics to learn and master, but the game also has a satisfying amount of progression to go with it, both in terms of unlocks and new challenges and levels to progress through. However, it might not be the best game for you if you hate punishing games, or games that require really good timing and reflexes. It also might not be the best game for you if you really need a lot of weapon and enemy variety to stay engaged. Still, if you're into action roguelites, or if you're into Souls-like games at all, I'd recommend you give it a shot. Please like this video to help me on the algorithm, and thanks for watching.